Printmaking is the process of making artworks by printing, normally on paper. Printmaking normally covers only the process of creating prints that have an element of originality, rather than just being a photographic reproduction of a painting. Except in the case of monotyping, the process is capable of producing multiples of a same piece, which is called a print. Each print produced is not considered a copy, but rather is considered an original. This is because typically each print varies to an extent due to variables intrinsic to the printmaking process, and also because the imagery of a print is typically not simply a reproduction of another work but rather is often a unique image designed from the start to be expressed in a particular printmaking technique. A print may be known as an impression. Printmaking is not chosen only for its ability to produce multiple impressions, but rather for the unique qualities that each of the printmaking processes lends itself to. Prints are created by transferring ink from a matrix or through a prepared screen to a sheet of paper or other material. Common types of matrices include metal plates, usually copper or zinc, or polymer plates for engraving or etching, stone, aluminum, or polymer for lithography, blocks of wood for woodcuts and wood engravings, and linoleum for lino cuts. Screens made of silk or synthetic fabrics are used for the screen printing process. Other types of matrix substrates and related processes are discussed below. Multiple impressions printed from the same matrix form an edition. Since the late 19th century, artists have generally signed individual impressions from an edition and often number the impressions to form a limited edition. The matrix is then destroyed so that no more prints can be produced. Prints may also be printed in book form, such as illustrated books or artist books. Techniques. Overview. Printmaking techniques are generally divided into the following basic categories. Relief, where ink is applied to the original surface of the matrix. Relief techniques include woodcut or woodblock as the Asian forms are usually known, wood engraving, lino cut and metal cut. Intaglio, where ink is applied beneath the original surface of the matrix. Intaglio techniques include engraving, etching, mezzotint, aquatint. Planographic, where the matrix retains its original surface but is specially prepared or inked to allow for the transfer of the image. Planographic techniques include lithography, monotyping, and digital techniques. Stencil, where ink or paint is pressed through a prepared screen, including screen printing and pockwire. Other types of printmaking techniques outside these groups include calligraphy, viscosity printing, and foil imaging. Calligraphy is a printmaking technique in which textured material is adhered to the printing matrix. This texture is transferred to the paper during the printing process. Contemporary printmaking may include digital printing, photographic mediums, or a combination of digital, photographic, and traditional processes. Many of these techniques can also be combined, especially within the same family. For example, Rembrandt's prints are usually referred to as etchings for convenience, but very often include work in engraving and dry point as well, and sometimes have no etching at all. Woodcut artists using this technique include Albrecht Dürer, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, Dola Marie Evans, Hiroshige Hokusai, Gustav Baumann, Hannah Tompkins, Hussein El Gebeli, Carlos Alvarado Lang. Woodcut, a type of relief print, is the earliest printmaking technique, and the only one traditionally used in the Far East. It was probably first developed as a means of printing patterns on cloth, and by the 5th century was used in China for printing text and images on paper. Woodcuts of images on paper developed around 1400 in Japan, and slightly later in Europe. These are the two areas where woodcut has been most extensively used purely as a process for making images without text. The artist draws a design on a plank of wood, or on paper which is transferred to the wood. Traditionally the artist then handed the work to a specialist cutter, who then uses sharp tools to carve away the parts of the block that will not receive ink. The surface of the block is then inked with the use of a brayer, and then a sheet of paper, perhaps slightly damp, is placed over the block. The block is then rubbed with a baron or spoon, or is run through a printing press. If in color, separate blocks can be used for each color, or a technique called reduction printing can be used. Reduction printing is a name used to describe the process of using one block to print several layers of color on one print. This usually involves cutting a small amount of the block away, and then printing the block many times over on different sheets before washing the block, cutting more away and printing the next color on top. This allows the previous color to show through. This process can be repeated many times over. The advantages of this process is that only one block is needed, and that different components of an intricate design will line up perfectly. The disadvantage is that once the artist moves on to the next layer, no more prints can be made. Another variation of woodcut printmaking is the kukul technique, made famous by the Taring Padi underground community in Java, Indonesia. Taring Padi posters usually resemble intricately printed cartoon posters embedded with political messages. Images, usually resembling a visually complex scenario, are carved onto a wooden surface called ULAN, then smothered with printer's ink before pressing it onto media such as paper or canvas. Engraving. The process was developed in Germany in the 1430s from the engraving used by goldsmiths to decorate metalwork. Engravers use a hardened steel tool called a burin to cut the design into the surface of a metal plate, traditionally made of copper. Engraving using a burin is generally a difficult skill to learn. Gravers come in a variety of shapes and sizes that yield different line types. The burin produces a unique and recognizable quality of line that is characterized by its steady, deliberate appearance and clean edges. Other tools such as mezzo tint rockers, roulettes and burnishers are used for texturing effects. To make a print, the engraved plate is inked all over, then the ink is wiped off the surface, leaving only ink in the engraved lines. The plate is then put through a high-pressure printing press together with a sheet of paper. The paper picks up the ink from the engraved lines, making a print. The process can be repeated many times. Typically several hundred impressions could be printed before the printing plate shows much sign of wear, except when dry point, which gives much shallower lines, is used. In the 20th century, true engraving was revived as a serious art form by artists including Stanley William Hayter, whose Studio 17 in Paris and New York City became the magnet for such artists as Pablo Picasso, Alberto Giacometti, Mauricio Lasansky and Joan Miro. Etching is part of the Intalia family. The process is believed to have been invented by Daniel Hopfer of Augsburg, Germany, who decorated armor in this way, and applied the method to printmaking. Etching soon came to challenge engraving as the most popular printmaking medium. Its great advantage was that, unlike engraving which requires special skill in metalworking, etching is relatively easy to learn for an artist trained in drawing. Etching prints are generally linear and often contain fine detail and contours. Lines can vary from smooth to sketchy. An etching is opposite of a woodcut in that the raised portions of an etching remain blank while the crevice hold ink. In pure etching, a metal plate is covered with a waxy or acrylic ground. The artist then draws through the ground with a pointed etching needle. The exposed metal lines are then etched by dipping the plate in a bath of etchant. The etchant bites into the exposed metal, leaving behind lines in the plate. The remaining ground is then cleaned off the plate, and the printing process is then just the same as for engraving. Artists using this technique include Albrecht Dürer, Rembrandt, Francisco Goya, Whistler, Otto Dix, James Ensor, Edward Hopper, Kathy Kollwitz, Pablo Picasso, Cy Twombly, Lucas van Leyden, Carlos Alvarado Lang. Mezzotint, an Intalia variant of engraving in which the image is formed from subtle gradations of light and shade. Mezzotint, from the Italian mezzo and tinta, is of dark manner form of printmaking, which requires artists to work from dark to light. To create a mezzotint, the surface of a copper printing plate is roughened evenly all over with the aid of a tool known as a rocker. The image is then formed by smoothing the surface with a tool known as a burnisher. When inked, the roughened areas of the plate will hold more ink and print more darkly, while smoother areas of the plate hold less or no ink, and will print more lightly or not at all. It is, however, possible to create the image by only roughening the plate selectively, so working from light to dark. Mezzotint is known for the luxurious quality of its tones. First, because an evenly, finely roughened surface holds a lot of ink, allowing deep solid colors to be printed. Secondly, because the process of smoothing the texture with burin, burnisher and scraper allows fine gradations in tone to be developed. The mezzotint printmaking method was invented by Ludwig von Siegen. The process was used widely in England from the mid-18th century, to reproduce oil paintings and portraits. Aquatint technique used in intaglio etchings. Like etching, aquatint technique involves the application of acid to make marks in a metal plate, where the etching technique uses a needle to make lines that retain ink. Aquatint relies on powdered rosin, which is acid-resistant in the ground, to create a tonal effect. The rosin is applied in a light dusting by a fan booth. The rosin is then cooked until set on the plate. At this time the rosin can be burnished or scratched out to affect its tonal qualities. The tonal variation is controlled by the level of acid exposure over large areas, and thus the image is shaped by large sections at a time. Goya used aquatint for most of his prints. Dry point, a variant of engraving, done with a sharp point, rather than a V-shaped burin. While engraved lines are very smooth and hard-edged, dry point scratching leaves a rough burr at the edges of each line. This burr gives dry point prints a characteristically soft, and sometimes blurry, line quality. Because the pressure of printing quickly destroys the burr, dry point is useful only for very small additions, as few as 10 or 20 impressions. To counter this, and allow for longer print runs, electroplating has been used since the 19th century to harden the surface of a plate. The technique appears to have been invented by the house bookmaster, a South German 15th-century artist, all of whose prints are in dry point only. Among the most famous artists of the Old Master print, Albrecht Dürer produced 3 dry points before abandoning the technique. Rembrandt used it frequently, but usually in conjunction with etching and engraving. Lithography artists using this technique include Honoré Daumier, Vincent van Gogh, George Bellows, Pierre Bonnat, Edward Munch, Émile Nolde, Pablo Picasso, Odilon Redon, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, Salvador Dali, C. Escher, Willem de Kooning, Joan Miro. Stowengian-Roth lithography is a technique invented in 1798 by Alois Senefelder and based on the chemical repulsion of oil in water. A porous surface, normally limestone, is used. The image is drawn on the limestone with a greasy medium. Acid is applied, transferring the grease to the limestone, leaving the image burned into the surface. Gum arabic, a water-soluble substance, is then applied, sealing the surface of the stone not covered with the drawing medium. The stone is wetted, with water staying only on the surface not covered in grease-based residue of the drawing. The stone is then rolled up, meaning oil ink is applied with a roller covering the entire surface. Since water repels the oil in the ink adheres only to the greasy parts, perfectly inking the image. A sheet of dry paper is placed on the surface, and the image is transferred to the paper by the pressure of the printing press. Lithography is known for its ability to capture fine gradations in shading and very small detail. A variant is photolithography, in which the image is captured by photographic processes on metal plates. Printing is carried out in the same way. Screen printing artists using this technique include Joseph Albers, Ralston Crawford, Gene Davis, Robert Indiana, Roy Lichtenstein, Julian Oppie, Bridget Riley, Edward Rusher, Andy Warhol, and Carlos Alvarado Lang. Screen printing creates prints by using a fabric stencil technique. Ink is simply pushed through the stencil against the surface of the paper, most often with the aid of a squeegee. Generally, the technique uses a natural or synthetic mesh fabric stretched tightly across a rectangular frame, much like a stretched canvas. The fabric can be silk, nylon, monofilament, multifilament polyester, or even stainless steel, a key to distinguishing high-quality from low-quality digital prints. Metallics are particularly difficult to reproduce accurately because they reflect light back to digital scanners. High-quality digital prints typically are reproduced with very high-resolution data files with very high-precision printers. The substrate used has an effect on the final colors and cannot be ignored when selecting a color palette. Pigment-based versus dye-based inks. Unlike pigment, dyes dissolve when mixed into a liquid. Dyes are organic. Although most are synthetic, derived from petroleum, they can be made from vegetable or animal sources. Dyes are well suited for textiles where the liquid dye penetrates and chemically bonds to the fiber. Because of the deep penetration, more layers of material must lose their color before the fading is apparent. Dyes, however, are not suitable for the relatively thin layers of ink laid out on the surface of a print. Pigment is a finely ground, particulate substance which, when mixed or ground into a liquid to make ink or paint, does not dissolve, but remains dispersed or suspended in the liquid. Pigments are categorized as either inorganic or organic. A pigment, such as red iron oxide, is simply an oxidized form of iron. One could leave iron, lead, or gold in the sun for 1,000,000 years and they would never change color or change into another substance. In contrast, man-made synthetic and vegetable water-soluble dyes can fade rapidly, often within 1 to 6 months. GICLEAQT is a neologism coined in 1991 by printmaker Jack Duggan for digital prints made on inkjet printers. It is based on the French word gicola, which means nozzle. Today, fine art prints produced on inkjet machines using the CCMMYK color model are generally called GICLEAQT. Foil imaging. Foil imaging is a printmaking technique made using the Iowa foil printer, developed by Virginia A. Myers from the commercial foil stamping process. This uses gold leaf and acrylic foil in the printmaking process.